Hello, I'm the Daily Storyteller, and I'm here to keep you company today. If you've visited my channel before, welcome back. And if this is your first time, I'm so glad to welcome you to the world of stories. I know many of you use these videos to relax or to help fall asleep more easily. So get comfortable, let your body relax, and allow the gentle sound of rain in the background to wash away your stress and worries. In this video, you'll hear chilling stories, most of them based on true events, told with honesty and depth. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Now then, let's begin. Story: The Haunted House. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just a few days in the countryside, far away from the city's incessant noise. But something about the house they rented seemed wrong from the moment they arrived. The house, a decaying Victorian structure, stood alone at the edge of a dense forest, its windows staring out like hollow eyes into the wilderness. The road leading up to it was overgrown with vines, and the creaky wooden fence that surrounded the property appeared as if it had not been touched for decades. It looked like a place that had been forgotten by time itself. James and his friends, Evelyn, Sarah and Mark, had come to escape their hectic lives in the city. They thought a weekend in nature would be refreshing, a chance to unwind and reconnect. But the moment they crossed the threshold of the house, an unsettling coldness seeped into their bones. The air was thick, as if something in the house was watching them. The front door slammed shut behind them with a resounding thud, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. The air inside was stale, musty, thick with the scent of mold and decay. A faint groaning sound came from somewhere deep within the house, as if the house itself was exhaling. It was a sound so low and subtle that it seemed like a distant whisper just beyond the edge of hearing. "It's just old," James said, trying to ease the growing tension. He threw his bag onto a dusty couch, the fabric groaning beneath the weight. "Old houses have character." Evelyn, the most adventurous of the group, smiled nervously. "It's perfect for Halloween weekend, don't you think?" They had no idea how true that would turn out to be. As night began to fall, the house seemed to transform. The floorboards creaked, shifting with a groan that resonated through the walls. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the old timbers of the house groaned under the pressure as if it were waking up after a long, unsettling sleep. A slow, deliberate tapping echoed somewhere above them, a rhythmic, almost methodical sound, like someone or something was walking around the upper floors. The four of them gathered around the fireplace, its flames casting flickering shadows that danced eerily on the walls. Mark, always the skeptic, joked about the creaks and groans of the house. "Ghosts don't exist," he said with a laugh, throwing another log onto the fire. "You're all just spooked by the setting." But Sarah, usually the quiet one, couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in her chest. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and grow with each flicker of the firelight. A faint scratching sound came from the walls, like nails being dragged across the wood. "I don't know," she whispered, her eyes flicking nervously around the room. "It feels like something's here, with us." James chuckled and shrugged off the comment, but Evelyn could see the worry in Sarah's eyes. They had all felt it, the oppressive presence that seemed to grow stronger as the night deepened. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to warm the air. A soft whispering sound, too soft to decipher, filled the space. It was so low, so faint, that they couldn't be sure whether they had heard it or if it was their minds playing tricks. But it came from somewhere deep inside the house, distant but undeniable. James stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the forest. He stared for a moment, something stirring deep within him, before he shook his head and turned back to the group. "I'm going to check out the rest of the house," he said. "It's way too quiet in here." Reluctantly, the others followed him as he ventured through the narrow hallways, their footsteps echoing off the creaky floors. The walls seemed to whisper, faint sounds just below the threshold of hearing, like hushed voices carried on the wind. The house felt even more alive now, as though it were trying to speak to them through the creaks and groans of its aging structure. They reached the staircase that led up to the second floor. The stairs were steep and uneven, each step creaking under their weight. A low, ominous hum seemed to emanate from somewhere above them, growing louder the higher they climbed. The temperature dropped with each step they took, the chills settling into their bones. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out before them, lined with closed doors. A sharp crackle came from the end of the hall, a door opening by itself, though no one had touched it. Evelyn reached out and opened the first door on the left. The room was large, filled with old, dusty furniture covered in white sheets, but there was something off about it. The sheets didn't hang right, as if they had been disturbed recently. A faint squeal echoed from beneath the floorboards, a sound like nails on a chalkboard, sending a shiver down their spines. "Let's go back downstairs," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't feel right here." But James, ever the leader, pressed on. "Just a few more rooms," he urged. "We came all this way. Let's explore." Reluctantly, the group followed him down the hallway, each room more unsettling than the last. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air growing thicker with each step. The floor beneath them groaned, as though the house was protesting their presence. As they reached the last door at the end of the hall, James paused. "There's something in here," he said quietly, almost to himself. He reached for the door handle and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a small room, much smaller than the others. It was empty, save for a dusty old rocking chair in the center of the room. But what caught their attention was the mirror on the far wall. It was large and ornate, framed in dark wood, but it was covered in a thick layer of dust. The room felt colder now, the temperature dropping even further. As James stepped closer to the mirror, a low whispering seemed to swirl around them, echoing from the glass. It was indistinct at first, but then they heard a single word, barely audible: "Leave." Before anyone could speak, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside the room. Panic surged through the group as they scrambled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Evelyn tried pulling at the handle, but it was locked from the outside. A sharp, metallic scraping sound reverberated from somewhere in the walls, like something scratching against metal. "James, what's going on?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Why is the door locked?" James glanced nervously at the mirror, his mind racing. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The reflection in the mirror didn't match the room. They were no longer standing in the dusty, forgotten room. Instead, they were in a dark, shadow-filled version of the room, the walls drenched in blood. "What the hell is happening?" Mark muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The rocking chair began to creak. Slowly, it moved back and forth on its own, despite the lack of any breeze. The chair squeaked louder, its movement jerky and unnatural. The air in the room grew colder, and the faint sound of whispering filled the space, growing louder, more insistent. It sounded like voices, low and menacing, chanting something they couldn't understand. The walls seemed to pulse as if they were alive, throbbing in rhythm with the whispers. Suddenly, the mirror began to crack. James backed away, heart racing, his breath shallow. A loud cracking noise filled the room, and the mirror splintered, the pieces beginning to fall away like shards of ice. "We need to get out of here, now!" But before they could react, a shadow in the mirror moved, something dark and twisted, taking form. It was a figure, hunched and grotesque, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It stepped forward in the reflection, its limbs too long and spindly, its face twisted into a cruel grin. A deep growl emanated from the figure, so low that it vibrated in their chests. Without warning, the door burst open and they tumbled out into the hallway. The house seemed to groan around them as if it were alive, angry. The walls shook, the very foundation of the house trembling with a deep, low rumble. They ran down the stairs, not daring to look back, the sound of heavy footsteps following them. They reached the front door, but it was locked. Panic set in again, and the shadows seemed to grow thicker, enveloping them. Just as James reached for the door handle, a cold hand gripped his shoulder from behind. He spun around, but no one was there, only the darkness. In a final desperate act, he yanked the door open. The cool night air hit their faces, but the house, its dark presence, still loomed behind them. They didn't look back as they ran, their footsteps pounding on the dirt road as they fled into the night. The haunted house was still there, waiting for the next victims to enter. Story: the weekend getaway. The drive to the cabin had been long, but the group of friends was excited to finally escape the hustle and bustle of city life. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, an idyllic retreat in the heart of the woods, far from everything. But as they pulled off the main road and onto the narrow, winding trail leading to the cabin, a strange unease began to settle over them. The road was barely wide enough for their car, and the trees grew so close together that the sun barely pierced through the thick canopy. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves beneath their tires and the occasional rustle of the wind. It felt like the world outside was slowly being shut out. "Are we sure this place is even real?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. He looked out the window, barely able to see beyond the thick trees. "Feels like we're driving into the middle of nowhere." "Relax, Mark," Rachel replied with a nervous laugh. "This is supposed to be a peaceful retreat. Nothing creepy is going to happen." But as the cabin came into view, even Rachel felt a knot form in her stomach. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the backdrop of the deep woods. The wooden structure was old, its once white paint peeling and fading into the grey of the overcast sky. The porch sagged to one side, and the roof had patches of missing shingles. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding that none of them could shake off. The air was unnaturally still, and the woods around them seemed to close in, muffling the outside world. "You weren't kidding when you said isolated," Sarah said, her voice low and hesitant. She was the most sensitive of the group, and the unease was spreading like a virus through the car. "Come on, it's just an old house," Rachel said, attempting to brush off the discomfort. "It's been empty for years, but we'll make the best of it." They unloaded their bags and stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, and the walls seemed to breathe with the house. It felt like the cabin had been waiting for them, watching them arrive. "Let's get the fire going," Mark suggested, eager to break the silence and the tension that had already settled in. Rachel glanced around the dimly lit living room. The furniture was old, mismatched, and draped in sheets that hadn't been moved in years. The heavy creaking of the floorboards echoed as she stepped deeper into the cabin, the eerie silence pressing down on them. They set up camp in the living room, gathered around the fireplace, but no matter how much they tried to relax, the house refused to let them. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, causing the cabin's windows to rattle. The flames in the fireplace flickered and cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. Mark tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but even he couldn't ignore the strange feeling in the air. The night grew darker, and the sound of the wind outside became a constant, ominous presence, like something trying to break into the cabin. Suddenly there was a loud bang from somewhere upstairs. The sound of something heavy being dropped, followed by a scraping noise, like furniture being dragged across the floor. Everyone froze. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted nervously toward the stairs. "I'll check it out," Mark said, standing up and brushing off the unease in his voice. "It's probably just the house settling." "Let me go take a look." Rachel, Sarah, and Emma exchanged glances. The air felt thick with dread, but no one wanted to admit it. Mark made his way to the stairs, the floorboards groaning beneath his feet with each step. As he ascended, the house seemed to sigh under the weight of his movement. He reached the top of the stairs and hesitated at the hallway. The sound was still there, faint but unmistakable, a dragging sound, like something heavy scraping against the wooden floor. "Hello?" Mark called into the dark hallway, his voice shaky but trying to remain steady. No answer. The house seemed to hold its breath. He stepped forward slowly, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. The scraping sound was louder now, accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible murmur, like whispering voices. Mark felt a chill creep up his spine. His breath caught in his throat. He pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a large old mirror on the far wall. But as he stepped closer to it, he felt something shift in the air, a sudden drop in temperature. His breath fogged in front of him as the whispers grew louder. A figure appeared in the reflection, a shadowy shape standing right behind him. Mark whipped around, but the room was still empty. His heart raced in his chest as he stared at the mirror again. The figure in the reflection moved, its face a blur, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The door slammed shut behind him, and Mark screamed, but the sound was muffled by the sudden deafening silence that enveloped him. Rachel and the others downstairs heard the door slam and rushed up the stairs, their hearts pounding. As they reached the hallway, they found Mark's flashlight on the floor, its beam casting erratic patterns on the walls. "Mark!" Rachel called, her voice tight with fear. But there was no answer. Only the soft, ominous hum of the house. The silence stretched out before them, thick and suffocating. Rachel turned the doorknob, but the door was locked from the inside. A faint tapping came from the other side of the door, rhythmic and unsettling, like nails tapping against wood. Rachel's hand shook as she pulled harder on the knob, but it wouldn't give. "We have to get in there," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "Mark's in there!" Rachel slammed her shoulder against the door, and finally, with a loud crack, it gave way. They tumbled into the room, the smell of cold, stale air hitting them all at once. But Mark was gone. The mirror was the only thing in the room, reflecting only empty space. "What's going on?" Emma whispered, her face pale with fear.
Where is he?
Suddenly, the whispering began again. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, as though something was pressing in on them from all sides. The temperature dropped further, the air growing thick with the stench of decay. The walls seemed to close in, as if the house itself was alive. The mirror began to crack, the glass groaning as it split down the center. Rachel stepped back, her heart racing. "We need to leave." "Now!" But before they could move, the whispers grew into a chorus of voices, shrill and garbled, calling their names. The air began to pulse, as though the house were breathing with them, inhaling and exhaling in slow, deliberate gasps. A loud bang came from the floor beneath them. Something large had just moved. Rachel grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her toward the door. They ran down the hall, the sound of footsteps following them, growing louder, faster. The house was shaking now, as if it were alive, ready to swallow them whole. As they reached the front door, it slammed shut in their faces, trapping them inside. A low, rumbling growl came from behind them, deep, guttural, and hungry. They turned to face the darkness, but nothing was there. Only the cold, oppressive silence. The house had claimed them. Story, the abandoned house. The house had been empty for years. At least that's what the locals believed. Nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest road, the old mansion stood like a forgotten relic, slowly being consumed by the forest. Ivy crawled up its crumbling walls, and the windows, once bright and welcoming, now stared out like hollow eyes. The roof sagged, and the paint had peeled away, leaving behind nothing but the decaying bones of a structure that time had left behind. Ryan, Jessica, and Thomas were looking for an adventure. They had spent hours online reading about haunted places, and when they stumbled upon the legend of the abandoned house, it seemed like the perfect challenge. Rumors circulated that the house was cursed, that anyone who entered would be trapped by the spirits that once lived there. But as always, they thought it was just another urban legend, nothing more than a spooky story to scare kids. The drive to the house had been long and uneventful. The air was thick with anticipation as they parked the car in front of the house. The trees surrounding them seemed to close in, blocking out the sunlight, casting long shadows over the driveway. The wind was still, but there was an undeniable sense of tension in the air. "Ready?" Ryan asked, his voice slightly trembling despite his confident tone. Jessica, ever the skeptic, laughed. "This place is a joke. No ghosts, no curses, just an old house." They approached the front door, which creaked loudly as Ryan pushed it open. The smell of mildew and rot hit them immediately, overpowering the faint scent of the woods. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned beneath their weight. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and shattered furniture lay scattered around the dimly lit rooms. "This place is a mess," Jessica remarked, kicking aside a broken chair. "We should check out the basement," Ryan suggested, always the one to push for the most daring explorations. He led the way toward the narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the house as they made their way down into the basement. The wooden steps creaked under their weight, and the air grew colder with every step. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves standing in a large, open room. The only light was from Ryan's flashlight, casting strange shadows on the walls. In the corner of the basement, something caught Thomas's eye. A large wooden chest, its surface warped and cracked, stood against the wall. It was covered in dust, as though no one had touched it in years. He moved toward it, curiosity piqued. "Don't touch it," Jessica warned, her voice nervous. But it was too late. As Thomas opened the chest, a foul smell rose from within, decayed flesh, old blood, and something even more disturbing. Inside, there were old clothes, bits of torn fabric, and a pile of brittle, yellowed papers. "What the hell is this?" Thomas muttered, pulling out one of the papers. It was a faded photograph of a woman, her face obscured by shadow, standing in front of the house. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, but what really made them shiver were her eyes, dark, hollow, and full of despair. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, followed by a deep, guttural growl from somewhere upstairs. The sound was so sudden, so close, that it felt like the entire house had shifted under their feet. They froze. The temperature seemed to drop drastically, and the air grew thick with a cold, oppressive pressure. "What was that?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," Ryan said, his face pale. But just as they turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, like something large being dragged across the floor. Ryan stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "We have to find another way out." The room suddenly grew darker, the flashlight's beam failing to pierce the thick blackness. An unnatural wind howled through the basement, knocking the old chest over with a violent force. Papers and old clothes scattered across the floor, but something more sinister followed, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to be coming closer. Ryan's hand shook as he grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it closed from the other side. "That's it! We're trapped!" Thomas shouted, panic rising in his voice. But just as they began to lose hope, a scream, sharp and full of anguish, pierced the air, so loud it rattled their bones. It came from upstairs, a woman's voice calling out in a long, drawn-out cry of pain. The floor beneath them trembled, and the house groaned as if it were alive, its wooden frame shifting and creaking in protest. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the temperature continued to plummet. "Move!" Ryan yelled, grabbing Jessica's arm and pulling her toward the back of the basement. They had to escape. They ran through the dark, winding corridors of the basement, the sound of their frantic footsteps mingling with the growls and screams echoing through the walls. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. As they turned the corner, Ryan stumbled, his foot catching on a loose floorboard. He crashed to the ground, his flashlight spinning out of control. The light danced across the walls, casting strange, shifting shadows. A cold, bony hand gripped his ankle, pulling him back toward the dark, rotting corners of the basement. He screamed and kicked, but the grip tightened. "Ryan!" Jessica screamed, reaching for him, but her hands passed through the air like she was grabbing nothing. The walls around them began to ripple, as though the house itself was alive, stretching and contorting. The sound of the scraping grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was in the house was moving closer. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as he fought against the unseen force pulling him deeper into the darkness. His vision blurred as the temperature continued to drop. A voice, low and guttural, whispered from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." Ryan's breath came in shallow gasps as he felt the cold, clammy fingers of the spirit pulling him toward the heart of the house. The room seemed to close in, the walls contracting as the darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing Ryan saw before everything went black was the photograph of the woman from the chest. Her hollow eyes were now wide open, staring directly at him. The house had claimed them. Story, the vengeful female ghost. It was the night of the festival, and the streets of the small village were alive with the laughter of children and the hum of celebration. Lanterns hung in every window, casting soft, warm light over the cobblestone streets. The air was filled with the scent of incense and fried dough, and for a moment it seemed as though everything was as it should be. But not far from the festivities, tucked away at the edge of the village, there stood an ancient, crumbling temple. Covered in vines and moss, the once grand structure was now little more than a forgotten ruin, shrouded in shadow. Locals often spoke of the temple in hushed tones, warning outsiders to stay away, for it was said to be cursed. The story that had been passed down through generations was one of vengeance and sorrow. Long ago, a beautiful young woman named Lynn had lived in the village. She had been the daughter of a wealthy merchant, admired by all who knew her. Her beauty was unparalleled, and her heart was as pure as her appearance. Lynn was promised to marry a man of high status, and the entire village rejoiced in their upcoming union. However, on the eve of her wedding, tragedy struck. Lynn's fiancé, a man named Min, had disappeared. For days there was no word from him. His family searched for him frantically, but he was never found. The village was in chaos, and Lynn was left heartbroken. Every night she sat at the edge of the temple, waiting for her love to return, but he never did. Months passed, and rumors began to spread. Whispers of betrayal, lies, and deceit swirled around Lynn. Some said that Min had run off with another woman. Others said he had been murdered, his body buried somewhere deep in the forest. Lynn, heartbroken and consumed by grief, could not accept the truth. She refused to believe that her beloved had abandoned her. One night she disappeared, leaving only a letter behind. The villagers said that Lynn had gone mad, driven to despair by the loss of her true love. They believed she had taken her own life, drowning herself in the village lake, her heart shattered beyond repair. But the temple held a darker truth. Lynn's spirit never left. It was said that on the anniversary of her disappearance, her ghost would rise from the depths of the lake, dressed in her wedding gown, searching for her lost love. Her beauty had become twisted with rage, and her once pure heart was now filled with an insatiable hunger for vengeance. Every year, the villagers would lock their doors and windows on that fateful night. They knew that if they weren't careful, they might hear the soft sound of bare feet dragging across the ground, the soft swish of fabric brushing against the cold stone floor, and the faint whisper of Lynn's voice calling out for Min. Her ghost would move through the streets, her eyes hollow and empty, searching for anyone who dared to enter her path. This year was no different. As the village prepared for the festival, no one spoke of Lynn's ghost, but the fear was palpable. Everyone knew what would happen when night fell. "Why do we still celebrate?" asked Hien, a young man new to the village. He had heard the whispers, but had dismissed them as old superstitions. "There's no reason to be afraid. It's just a story." The elders, sitting around the bonfire, exchanged uneasy glances. "You do not understand," one of the old women said. "The curse is real. Lynn's spirit still roams these lands, and she has not forgotten the betrayal." But Hien, determined to prove his bravery, decided he would visit the temple that very night. He wanted to show that there was nothing to fear, that the old stories were nothing more than myths. As dusk began to fall, he slipped away from the festivities, making his way toward the edge of the village. The moment Hien crossed into the forest that surrounded the temple, the air grew colder. A sharp wind began to howl through the trees, rustling the leaves in an eerie whisper. The night seemed to hold its breath, and the ground beneath his feet felt unnaturally soft, as though the earth itself was swallowing him up. The temple loomed ahead, its dark silhouette casting a long shadow over the ground. As Hien stepped closer, he heard a faint sound, a soft rustling, like the brushing of silk against the floor. His heart quickened. He turned, but saw nothing. He stood in front of the temple's crumbling entrance and hesitated. The door, once grand and imposing, was now rotted and half collapsed. Yet there was something about it that seemed to beckon him. His curiosity overwhelmed his fear, and he stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was suffocating. The only sound was the faint thrum of his heartbeat in his ears, growing louder with every passing second. As he ventured deeper into the temple, the temperature dropped, the cold creeping through his bones. His breath came out in visible puffs, but the cold was not the only thing that made him shiver. A faint melodic hum reached his ears, like a lullaby sung from a great distance. It seemed to be coming from the back of the temple. Hien, unwilling to turn back, followed the sound, his footsteps echoing off the stone floor. When he reached the inner sanctum, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the center of the room, stood a figure, a woman draped in white, her long black hair cascading down her back. The figure was completely still, her back turned to him. "Hello?" Hien called out, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure turned slowly, her face obscured by shadows. Her eyes were hollow, two dark voids that seemed to pull in all light. Her lips parted in a soft, breathless sigh. "Min," she whispered, her voice filled with a sorrow so deep it could not be measured. Hien froze, the words sticking in his throat. A chill ran through his entire body as the realization hit him. The ghost of Lin was standing right in front of him. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further. The walls of the temple groaned as though they were alive, responding to the ghost's presence. The soft hum turned into a low growl, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe around Lin's form. Her hand reached out toward him, and Hien tried to move, but his body refused to obey. The ground beneath him trembled, as though the very earth was shaking with the rage of a woman scorned. "Min!" Lin's voice echoed, her tone growing desperate, frantic. The walls cracked with the force of her anger. The ghost's figure began to distort, her once beautiful face twisting into a horrific mask of rage and sorrow. Before Hien could react, a deafening scream filled the air, Lin's anguished cry, then everything went silent. He fell to the ground, his heart pounding, his body shaking uncontrollably. When he looked up, the temple was empty. Lin was gone. But he could still hear her whispering in his ears, her words haunting him. "Min, Min." The darkness closed in around him, suffocating as the curse of the vengeful female ghost claimed yet another victim. Story, the haunted forest. The forest was old, ancient even. Locals called it the Whispering Woods, though few dared to venture into its depths. They said the trees had eyes, watching, waiting. Over the years, people had gone missing, lost within its dark, tangled paths. No one ever found them again. Victor, Sarah, and Ben had heard the stories, but they weren't the superstitious types. They had come to the small town for a weekend getaway, eager to escape the busy city life. One evening, as the sun began to set and the amber light painted the sky, They overheard some locals talking about the haunted forest over their drinks at the pub. "The old woods beyond the town, you mean?" Victor had asked, smirking. "Don't be foolish," one of the men warned, his face serious. "People go in, but they don't come out the same. Or at all." He leaned in closer, voice dropping to a whisper. "If you're not careful, it takes you. You'll hear things, voices in the wind. And other things too." "Don't listen to him," Sarah laughed, nudging Victor. "Sounds like a perfect place for an adventure." "An adventure, huh?" Ben chimed in, grinning. "I'm in. We can just go in and see if we can find some of those so-called voices." Victor hesitated, but shrugged. "I don't believe in that stuff. But let's go and get it over with." A hike through the haunted woods, right? That night, as the moon began its climb into the sky, the trio made their way toward the edge of the forest. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned in response, their branches swaying like skeletal arms. The path was narrow, overgrown with brambles and ivy that tugged at their clothes as they walked deeper into the forest. Sarah led the way, her flashlight slicing through the dense undergrowth. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching and twisting with every step. The further they walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the very air was heavier, filled with a presence that was both foreign and unsettling. "I swear, the air feels colder," Ben remarked, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. "It's the trees," Sarah replied. "The forest is dense. It's blocking the wind, that's all." But even Sarah couldn't ignore the way the darkness pressed in around them. A soft whisper seemed to travel on the breeze, and she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. The trees around them swayed and creaked as though they were alive, breathing in time with the wind. The farther they ventured, the less they could hear of the world outside the woods. The sound of distant voices and laughter from the village had long faded, replaced by the unnerving rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig beneath their feet. Suddenly, Victor stopped in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. Sarah and Ben turned, looking at him. He was staring into the distance, his face pale. "What is it?" Ben asked, eyes scanning the darkness. I don't know. It sounded like footsteps, but there's no one else here." They stood in silence, listening. A soft, slow rhythm, like footsteps dragging through the dirt, followed by a rustling sound, echoed from somewhere deeper in the woods. Then the whispers began, low, indistinct voices carried by the wind. Sarah's flashlight flickered, its beam jumping from one shadow to the next. "It's probably just some animal. We're in a forest." But even as she spoke, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, more insistent. "Victor, Ben, Sarah." The voices were not just whispers now. They were clear, calling their names, their voices filled with an eerie sweetness. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. "I'm out of here," Victor said suddenly, turning to head back down the path. But as soon as he turned, the whispering intensified, now coming from all directions. It wasn't just voices. They were shapes, shadowy figures forming between the trees, just out of reach of their light. A sudden gust of wind blew through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of something old, damp, musty, and putrid. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, as if it were alive, pressing in on them. "I can't move," Ben gasped, his legs shaking. "It's like the trees are pulling me in." The whispers grew louder still. The shadows twisted around them, stretching across the ground like dark tendrils, trying to pull them into the earth itself. Panic surged through Sarah as she looked around, realizing they were surrounded. "Run!" she screamed, grabbing Victor and Ben by the arms and pulling them with her. She didn't know which way they were running, just that they needed to get out. The air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, the shadows flickering in and out of existence, chasing them, trapping them in a maze of trees that seemed to change their shape as they ran. The forest was alive, shifting with every step they took. Victor stumbled, falling to the ground as a hand, no, something more than a hand, reached out from the trees, grabbing his ankle. It was cold, icy cold, and it burned his skin as it pulled him toward the earth. "Victor!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was drowned by the roar of wind that had suddenly picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of anguished souls. Victor managed to rip his leg free, but the force of the pull had knocked him off balance, sending him sprawling into the thick underbrush. His flashlight rolled from his grasp, illuminating only the shadows as it spun across the ground. Ben grabbed Victor's arm, yanking him back to his feet. "We need to get out now!" he shouted, panic in his voice. As they scrambled back toward the path, the whispers reached a crescendo, turning into a deafening cacophony of voices, all calling their names in unison. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the forest fell silent. The trees stood still. The wind stopped. The whispers faded into nothing. They stood in the middle of the clearing, breathing heavily, staring at the path before them. It was as if the forest had swallowed everything. Gone were the oppressive shadows and the suffocating silence. The woods now seemed empty, silent. I don't like this," Sarah said, trembling. "We need to leave, now." But as they turned to make their way out, a figure appeared in the distance, a shadowy silhouette standing in the path, blocking their exit. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it seemed to float just above the ground. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. "Who are you?" Victor whispered, though the words barely left his lips. The figure didn't move, but the air around them grew cold again, the whispering voices beginning to return, faint at first, but growing louder, more frantic, as if the very forest was coming alive to claim them. Ben took a step back. "It's one of them. It's one of the lost souls," he muttered, his eyes wide with terror. The figure began to move toward them. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the leaves rustling as if the earth itself was reacting to its presence. And then, as it stepped closer, it spoke. "Leave this place," it said, its voice low and filled with a cold, deathly authority. "This forest is not for you." Without a second thought, Sarah turned and ran. The others followed, their feet pounding against the earth, their breath quick and shallow. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, the trees closing in as though they were being chased by an unseen force. And just as they reached the edge of the forest, the figure disappeared. The whispering stopped. The forest fell silent once more. They emerged from the woods, gasping for air, their hearts pounding. The night was still, and the village lights were far in the distance. We're alive," Victor whispered, his voice trembling, but the forest was still behind them, waiting. And the shadows once again whispered their names. Story. Eyes in the night. It was a night like any other in the small town of Ashford. The streets were quiet, the kind of stillness that only a rural town could offer. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the houses and streets, and there was a sense of calm in the air. But for Marissa, the night felt different. There was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She had moved to Ashford just a month ago. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the chaos of city life and the haunting memories of her past. But from the moment she stepped into her new home, something felt wrong. The house, though charming and old, had a coldness to it. The walls creaked at night, and every once in a while she could swear she heard footsteps when she was alone. But tonight was worse. Marissa had spent the evening unpacking and organizing her things, trying to make the house feel more like home. She was in the kitchen when she felt it, a sudden chill, like someone had opened a window. Her breath came out in a visible puff, despite the warmth of the room. Shaking her head, she grabbed her coat and went to close the front door, but before she could reach it, she froze. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw something moving in the darkness outside. There, just beyond the porch light's reach, two glowing eyes stared back at her. The eyes were wide, unblinking, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin as she stared at them, unable to look away. The eyes didn't move. They didn't even blink. They just glowed, like two spots of light in the darkness. "Hello?" Marissa called, her voice trembling. There was no response. The eyes remained. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. Something in those eyes kept her rooted to the spot. It was as if they were calling to her, drawing her in. She shook her head, trying to break the trance. The eyes blinked, just once, slowly, and then the figure behind them shifted. It was tall, far taller than any man she had ever seen, its body cloaked in shadow. The eyes remained, glowing brighter now, as though the figure itself was feeding off her fear. Without thinking, she slammed the door shut, locking it behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. She backed away from the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The eyes were still there, still watching her, just outside the door. Marissa's mind raced. Who could it be? Was it someone from the town playing a prank? But something in the pit of her stomach told her it wasn't a joke. She didn't know who or what it was, but she could feel its presence, like it was waiting for her to make the wrong move. The door rattled in its frame, as though something was pressing against it from the outside. A low, guttural growl sounded from the other side, vibrating the door beneath her hand. Marissa stepped back, fear gripping her chest. She ran for the phone, but the line was dead. The growling grew louder, almost deafening now. The eyes appeared in the window, glowing through the thin curtains. But now they weren't alone. There were more. Hundreds of eyes, all glowing and watching her, all pressing against the glass as if they were waiting to get in. She screamed, backing away from the window. Her heart raced. She had to get out of there. She had to leave the house. But as she reached for the door again, she realized she couldn't move fast enough. The eyes were everywhere, staring at her through the windows, the door, the cracks in the walls. They were closing in. The growl came again, this time louder, and she felt a pressure in her chest, like the air around her was growing heavier. The eyes outside were pressing in, a massive force pushing against her, forcing her to feel its presence in every inch of her skin. The door rattled once more, louder this time, and then the shadows beyond the door began to shift. The figure, whatever it was, stepped into the light, revealing itself completely. It was tall, towering over her, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long. Its body was cloaked in darkness, its form indistinct. The only thing that was clear were the eyes, hundreds of them, each one staring at her, unblinking, their gaze never leaving her. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The eyes remained, though. They stayed outside the house, staring at her through the windows, and she knew then that they would never leave. The forest, the night, the house, they were all connected to something much older, something that had been waiting. Marissa couldn't sleep. She lay wide awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The sound of the growling was still fresh in her mind, reverberating in her ears. The eyes were still out there, watching her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them glowing, unblinking, always waiting. She had tried to call for help, but the lines were still dead. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too empty. The wind howled outside, but the air in the house was thick, suffocating. She couldn't explain it, but it felt as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The next morning, she tried to push the terror from her mind, telling herself it was just a nightmare. But when she looked outside, the eyes were still there. They were in the trees, glowing through the leaves like the embers of a dying fire. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of eyes, all staring, all watching, all waiting. The forest surrounding her house was alive with their presence. That afternoon, she ventured into town, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening, someone who could help. She stopped at the local diner, and the waitress smiled at her as she walked in, but something in her eyes made Marissa pause. "I'll have the special," Marissa said, sitting at the counter. But the waitress didn't respond. Instead, she stared at Marissa with the same unsettling gaze. Then, the door opened behind Marissa, and she turned to look, but no one was there. Just empty space. But the moment her eyes shifted back to the waitress, she froze. The woman was now standing in front of her, her face expressionless, her eyes glowing an unnatural shade of yellow. "You should leave," the woman whispered. "The eyes, they never stop watching. They never let go." Marissa stood, her heart racing. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The waitress stepped closer, her eyes glowing brighter with each step. And then, suddenly, the diner door slammed open. A gust of wind rushed in, and Marissa saw the figure again, tall, dark, and with hundreds of eyes now appearing in the doorway. The growl filled the air again, louder this time, and the waitress smiled. "You're not going to make it," she said softly, before vanishing into the mist that had suddenly filled the room. Marissa ran, but no matter where she went, the eyes were always there, always following her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Story: The Dark Path. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, yet there was something unnervingly silent about the path before them. The trees stretched up high, their thick branches blocking out most of the light from the moon. It felt as though the sky had been swallowed by the dense canopy, and even the usual hum of crickets was strangely absent. The wind didn't stir the leaves, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Mia, Jack, and Lucas had taken the hike through the woods before, but this time the dark path felt different. They had heard about it, the forbidden trail, marked with old warnings, the one people dared not tread after sunset. But on this cool autumn evening, they had arrived just before dusk, and the thought of a short detour for a bit of adventure was too tempting to resist. "We'll be fine," Jack had said earlier, laughing off the warnings. "It's just a path through the woods, right?" What could go wrong? But now, as they walked deeper into the woods, Mia could feel a strange weight in the air. The path, though clear at first, seemed to narrow with every step, the trees growing thicker, their twisted branches forming eerie silhouettes in the dimming light. "Jack, I don't like this," Mia said quietly, her voice shaky. Jack waved her off, still confident. "You're just spooked. It's all in your head." But Mia wasn't convinced. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and there was a feeling in her gut, something primal, telling her to turn back. She looked behind them, but the way they came was obscured now. The path had become a maze, twisting and winding, as though the forest itself was rearranging. "You're acting paranoid," Jack said, noticing her hesitation. "It's just the fog. It's messing with your head." But as they continued down the path, the air seemed to grow heavier, and Mia began to feel like they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder again, and this time the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. There was a presence, something in the woods, something watching them from the shadows. It wasn't just the trees, it was something deeper, older. The sudden snap of a twig behind them made them all stop. For a moment, everything was completely still. The forest had gone eerily silent, as if even the wind was holding its breath. "Did you hear that?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Before Mia could answer, a sound echoed through the trees. A low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the sound of any animal they recognized. It was deep, unnatural, like something hungry. Mia's heart began to race. "We need to get out of here." Jack scoffed, but even he couldn't hide the unease in his voice. "Fine, let's head back. But we've got to keep walking. The path's probably just around the next corner." They continued forward, but the growl came again, louder this time, accompanied by a distant rustling sound. The trees seemed to shift, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. Mia turned to Jack. "We need to go. Now!" Jack's face was pale. He glanced around, then nodded. Okay, let's go back." But when they tried to turn around, the path they had come from seemed to vanish. The trees, once standing in an orderly line, now appeared to have closed in, blocking their way. The stone-like path was gone. "This isn't right," Mia whispered, panic rising in her chest. "We came from this way, right? This path. It wasn't like this before." Lucas stepped forward, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. But the light seemed to fade as soon as it hit the trees, swallowed up by the thickening darkness. "What the hell?" Lucas muttered, shaking the flashlight. "The batteries must be dead." Suddenly the growl came again, louder, closer. This time it was followed by a shuffling sound, something dragging through the underbrush, its movements jerky and uneven, as if it was stalking them. "We need to run," Mia said, her voice trembling. But before anyone could move, a figure appeared in the shadows. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its face was hidden beneath a cloak of darkness. But the worst part was the eyes, bright, glowing eyes, glaring from beneath the hood, watching them intently. Mia's blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its slow, deliberate steps sending a wave of dread through her. The growl from earlier came again, but now it sounded like it was right behind them. "Run!" Mia screamed, turning and bolting down the path, her legs shaking with fear. Jack and Lucas followed, but the path seemed to stretch on endlessly, no end in sight. The sound of footsteps behind them, heavy and unrelenting, seemed to grow louder with every step they took. It was gaining on them. They reached a clearing, an open space at the heart of the woods. The moonlight was finally able to break through the clouds, illuminating the clearing in an eerie glow. The figure was there, standing in the center of the clearing, its eyes locked onto them, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Mia's breath caught in her throat. A howl filled the air, loud and piercing, so shrill it felt like it was coming from inside her skull. The ground beneath them began to shake, and the trees around the clearing seemed to lean in, as if the forest itself were alive and moving. "Get out of here!" Mia shouted, pulling Jack and Lucas toward the other side of the clearing. But before they could move, a sharp crack echoed through the air. The ground beneath them split, and a massive root burst from the ground, snaking toward them with terrifying speed. They turned and ran, dodging the writhing tendril, but the forest seemed to close in around them. The ground trembled again, and the figure in the clearing vanished, only to reappear right in front of them. It reached out with its long, twisted arms. Its touch was ice cold, freezing the air as it neared. "No!" Mia screamed, pushing past the fear that gripped her, grabbing Lucas and Jack's hands as they ran through the forest with all the strength they had left. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they stumbled out of the woods, gasping for breath. The town's lights were just ahead, and the growl, the figure, and the cursed path were finally behind them. But even as they emerged from the trees, they could still feel the weight of the forest's gaze on them. The whispers followed them, fading in and out of hearing, as if the path itself were calling them back. Maya turned to look at the forest one last time, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw the glowing eyes watching her from the edge of the trees. Story: The Ghost in the Mirror. It was a typical Sunday afternoon when Elena found the mirror. She had been cleaning out her late grandmother's house for weeks now, sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. There were stacks of old books, boxes filled with yellowed photographs, and dusty trinkets that no one had touched in years. But it was in the attic, hidden beneath a faded blanket, that she found the mirror. It wasn't a large mirror, but it wasn't small either. About 4 feet tall, the frame was ornately carved with delicate patterns of vines and roses running along its edges. The wood was dark and polished, gleaming despite the dust and years of neglect. Eleanor was drawn to it immediately, as though something in the mirror was calling to her. "Another one of Grandma's oddities," she muttered to herself, rolling her eyes as she brushed away the dust. She never threw anything away. But as her fingers brushed against the glass, a strange chill ran through her. The mirror felt cold, far colder than it should have. She pulled her hand back, confused by the sensation. Shaking her head, she stood up and wiped the dust from the frame, intending to take it downstairs and give it a good cleaning. The moment she lifted it, however, she froze. The reflection wasn't hers. Eleanor's own reflection should have been visible, but instead the mirror showed a dark, empty hallway, the walls covered in shadows. A faint, indistinct figure lingered at the edge of the frame, just out of view. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stepped back, horrified. Her breath quickened as she looked around the attic, but there was no one there. She turned to the mirror again, but now it showed her reflection, exactly as it should have. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion. "Okay," she said aloud, trying to calm herself. "It's just an old mirror. There's got to be some explanation." But deep down, she knew that something was wrong. Later that night, after a long day of sorting through her grandmother's belongings, Eleanor couldn't shake the strange feeling the mirror had left her with. As the clock struck midnight, she found herself unable to sleep. The house creaked and groaned in the silence of the night, the old wooden beams settling. She lay in bed, the darkness pressing in around her, when an inexplicable urge tugged at her, She had to go back to the attic. Without thinking, she got out of bed, her feet cold against the floorboards. The house was still, save for the faint sounds of the wind outside. The mirror called to her, an invisible pull she couldn't resist. When she reached the attic, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The mirror was still leaning against the wall, and for a moment Eleanor hesitated. But then she took a deep breath and approached it, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the frame. As soon as her fingers brushed against the mirror's surface, the room seemed to darken, the shadows growing deeper. Elena's reflection appeared, but it looked different, distorted. Her face seemed to twist, her eyes black and hollow, her expression empty and lifeless. "Hello," she whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. The reflection didn't answer. Elena's pulse quickened as the air grew colder. The figure from earlier, the one she had seen at the edge of the mirror, was now visible. It was a woman standing just behind Eleanor's reflection. Her skin was pale and ghostly, her hair long and dark, hanging in strands over her face. The woman's eyes were wide and staring, glowing with an unnatural light. Before Elena could react, the figure in the mirror raised her hand, reaching toward Elena's reflection. The room seemed to grow darker still, the shadows twisting unnaturally. Eleanor staggered back, her breath shallow, panic rising in her chest. She turned to run, but the mirror began to shimmer, like it was alive, the surface rippling as though something was trying to push through. Eleanor stumbled backward, her heart racing, the sound of her breath echoing in her ears. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror. The figure in the reflection was no longer still. The woman was moving toward her, reaching for her, her hand outstretched. Eleanor gasped, instinctively backing away, but the room seemed to be closing in around her. The air was thick and suffocating, and as she moved further back, she realized the attic seemed to stretch endlessly in the reflection. The real room was small, but in the mirror it was as if there was no end to the space. The woman in the mirror smiled, a slow, unsettling grin, and whispered something Eleanor couldn't quite hear. The whisper was like a song in a foreign language, haunting and otherworldly. "Get away from it!" Elena shouted at the mirror, her voice shaky, but the reflection didn't change. The figure still reached out for her, the smile on its face widening. Suddenly, the woman's hand slammed against the mirror, leaving a smudge of cold, dark energy across the glass. Elena staggered back, tripping over an old trunk in the corner. The mirror's surface shimmered again, and this time, when Eleanor looked into it, she didn't see her own reflection at all. The mirror was completely empty, a void, as if there was nothing behind the glass. A soft, whispering voice called from the void, "Help me!" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the voice. It was the woman from the reflection, but it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. A desperation filled the room, an energy that seemed to pulse from the mirror itself. Terrified, Elena stumbled backward, her hands trembling as she fumbled for something to cover the mirror. But as she reached out, the glass cracked, a loud, jagged sound that echoed through the room. The crack spread across the surface like a spider's web, and the whispering grew louder, filling her ears with a desperate, incomprehensible chant. She couldn't take it any longer. With one last burst of strength, Eleanor ran from the attic, slamming the door shut behind her. But the mirror, the reflection, followed her. Every time she looked in the glass of her bedroom mirror, there it was, the same woman standing just behind her, her eyes wide and glowing, her mouth moving, whispering. Eleanor tried to ignore it, to push it out of her mind, but she knew the truth. The mirror had claimed her, and now the woman in the mirror was waiting for her to come back. Story, the silent watcher. Sophia had always been aware of the house's oddities. The old manor had been in her family for generations, passed down through the years with all its creaking floors, dimly lit corridors, and thick, musty air. It was the kind of house you only half wanted to spend the night in, its vast rooms full of shadows and memories, whispering secrets just out of earshot. But it had been home for as long as she could remember, and it was where she had returned after years of living in the city. The day she moved back in, she felt a strange tension in the air. Something was different about the house, something that hadn't been there before. The rooms were colder than she remembered, the furniture more disordered, as if it had been disturbed by an unseen hand. As she unpacked, she tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, attributing it to the long absence. But that night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she could swear she heard soft footsteps pacing in the hall outside her bedroom door. At first, she thought it was her imagination, an old house settling perhaps, but the sound was too deliberate, too persistent. The footsteps stopped right outside her door, and she held her breath, straining to hear. Nothing. Just silence. Sophia's heart raced as she waited, the minutes stretching on endlessly. She finally got up, the floorboards creaking under her feet as she crossed the room to check the hallway. But when she opened the door, the corridor was empty, the shadows deep and uninviting. She sighed, half relieved and half uneasy, shutting the door quietly behind her. But the feeling lingered, the sense that she was being watched. The following night, the footsteps returned. This time, Sophia wasn't so quick to dismiss them. She stood at her door, listening as the slow, deliberate steps echoed through the house. They seemed to circle her room, pausing and then continuing, always moving just out of sight. With each passing minute, the tension grew thicker, the air heavier, as though something was lurking just beyond her reach. The next morning, she decided to confront it. She spent hours searching the house, every room, every closet, every corner, but found nothing. No sign of intruders, no indication that anyone else had been there. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. The unease persisted, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. As the days passed, the footsteps grew more frequent. They began in the middle of the night, but soon they started during the day as well. Sometimes they were faint, distant. Other times they were right outside her door, too close for comfort. It wasn't long before she started seeing things, flickers of movement in the corner of her eye, figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. A shadow slipping past the window, the vague outline of a figure standing at the end of a hallway. When she turned to look, there was nothing. The house had always been a little eerie, but now it felt as though something was truly amiss. Something or someone was watching her. Sophia began researching the history of the house, hoping to find an explanation for the strange happenings. She pored over old family records, documents and journals written by her ancestors, but found nothing that would explain the increasing sense of dread. The manor had been in her family for centuries, passed down from generation to generation with no real record of strange occurrences until now. She found one journal entry that caught her attention, written by her great-great-grandfather, a man she had never known. The entry was brief, almost cryptic. "The Watcher has returned. I feel its eyes on me always. It walks through the halls at night. I am not alone." Sophia's skin crawled as she read the words. Was it a reference to the footsteps she had been hearing? The feeling of being followed? She couldn't be sure, but something about it struck a deep chord within her. she decided to investigate further, walking through the manor again, this time with more purpose. She searched every hallway, every room, looking for any clue, any sign that could explain the strange phenomenon. She came to the grand staircase and stopped at the bottom, staring up at the long, dark corridor that led to the upper floors. The air grew cold, the temperature dropping noticeably. Sophia's breath came out in visible puffs, and she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. She began to climb the stairs, every creak of the wood beneath her feet sounding impossibly loud. As she reached the top, a sound echoed from the far end of the hallway. The footsteps. But this time, they weren't distant. They were close, very close. Almost right behind her. Sophia turned around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the long, dark hallway stretching into the shadows. The footsteps stopped, leaving her in a profound silence. The coldness lingered in the air as she walked further down the hallway, her pulse racing. She came to a door at the far end, one she hadn't noticed before. It was old, the wood warped with age, the knob covered in layers of dust. It felt wrong, as though something was hiding behind it. Without thinking, she reached for the door. As her hand touched the knob, the house seemed to shudder, and a cold gust of wind rushed past her, blowing out the candle she had been holding. The door creaked open, revealing a small room that seemed to have been sealed off for decades. Inside was a large, ornate mirror, an antique, its glass slightly fogged and cracked with age. The frame was dark and twisted, almost as though it had been deliberately warped. A figure stood in the reflection. At first, Sophia thought it was just her own image. After all, she was standing directly in front of the mirror. But something was wrong. Her reflection was distorted, twisted in a way that made her stomach lurch. It wasn't just her face. It was as if the entire image was shifting. The figure in the reflection moved, its eyes locking onto hers. The figure smiled, a slow, wicked grin that made Sophia's blood run cold, but she couldn't look away. The smile in the reflection grew wider, its eyes darker, and the more she stared, the more the air around her seemed to grow oppressive. The footsteps came again, louder now, as if something was right behind her, breathing down her neck. The figure in the mirror began to move toward her, its hands stretching out toward the glass. In a panic, Sophia stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in the process. She spun to leave the room, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Her heart raced as the reflection in the mirror began to change. It was no longer her face looking back. The figure was grinning at her now, its smile impossibly wide, its eyes hollow and dark. The whisper came again, barely audible but unmistakable. "You are not alone." Sophia screamed, pounding on the door, but the footsteps continued, getting louder and louder. The whispering grew louder, surrounding her, suffocating her with its weight. In a desperate bid for freedom, she lunged for the mirror, intending to smash it with anything she could find. But as her hand touched the glass, the world around her froze. Her reflection was no longer just a reflection. It stepped out of the mirror. Story. The silent watcher. Lena had always been a city girl. She loved the hustle and bustle, the endless noise, the crowds. But after the accident, after everything that happened, she needed a break. She needed to escape. So when her cousin offered her the old cottage in the countryside for a weekend, she jumped at the chance. The cottage was far off the beaten path, surrounded by dense woods, and the nearest town was miles away. When Lena arrived, the first thing she noticed was the silence. It was almost deafening. the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, the kind of quiet where you can hear every creak of your own footsteps. Her cousin had given her the keys, but she hadn't given her any warnings, no cautionary tales, no instructions. The cottage was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace and wooden beams that seemed to stretch to the heavens. The furniture was old but charming, the kind of place where time felt suspended, like the world outside didn't exist. Lena unpacked her things, trying to shake off the weight of her thoughts, the memories that had been haunting her. She made herself a cup of tea, sat by the fire, and let the warmth comfort her. The first night was peaceful, the kind of quiet that felt refreshing. It felt like she was finally able to breathe again. But then, things began to change. The next night, Lena woke to the feeling of eyes on her. It was subtle at first. A shift in the air, a slight rustle of the curtains, the faintest movement in the corner of her vision. She opened her eyes, but the room was dark and still. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, that it was the wind, that it was the shadows playing tricks on her, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The next day, she checked the locks on all the doors and windows just to reassure herself. Everything was secure. Still, the unease lingered. That night, the whispers started. They were faint at first, like the softest breeze brushing against her ear. Lena lay in bed, straining to hear, but all she could catch were fragments, words she couldn't quite make out. She turned over, trying to ignore it, but the whispering grew louder, as if someone was standing right next to her, speaking in a language she didn't understand. She bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. The room was still, silent. She threw the covers back, reaching for the light switch, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, as if they were alive. Something was in the room with her. She could feel it. She wasn't alone. The whispers had stopped, but the presence lingered, a suffocating weight pressing on her chest. Lena swung her legs off the bed and grabbed the flashlight she'd placed on the nightstand. She held it in front of her like a weapon as she cautiously stepped toward the door. When she opened it, she was met with nothing but darkness. Her breath quickened as she scanned the hallway, but it was empty. Just the old wooden floors, the worn-down walls, and the faint creaks of the cottage settling. She exhaled in relief, telling herself she was just being paranoid. She returned to her room and tried to sleep, but the sensation of being watched never left. Lena spent the next day exploring the woods behind the cottage, hoping the fresh air would help clear her mind. She walked for hours, trying to lose herself in the beauty of the nature surrounding her. The trees towered over her, their leaves rustling in the breeze, but there was still an oppressive silence, the same eerie quiet that had filled the cottage. By the time the sun began to set, she felt exhausted, both physically and mentally. She returned to the cottage and took a long shower, trying to shake off the sense of dread that had been creeping up on her since she arrived. That night, as she sat by the fire, a strange thought crossed her mind. What if I wasn't alone? The thought was absurd, of course. There was no one else in the cottage. She was just letting her imagination get the better of her. But when she glanced at the windows, she noticed something strange. The curtains were slightly parted, just enough for someone to look inside. The woods outside were pitch black, the trees swaying in the wind, and yet something felt off. As if something was watching her from the darkness. The whispering returned that night. Only this time, it wasn't just whispers. It was a voice, low and menacing. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere. She sat up in bed, holding the flashlight in her hand, but when she turned it on, the beam cast nothing but shadows. The voice grew louder, and she could hear the words clearly now. "You shouldn't be here." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She scrambled out of bed and rushed to the door, but when she opened it, she was confronted by a figure standing in the hallway. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, its features indistinguishable. It stood motionless, watching her with dark, hollow eyes. "Who are you?" Lena choked out, her voice barely a whisper. But the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, silent, unmoving. She backed away, but the figure followed, stepping closer, its presence overwhelming. She turned and fled down the hallway, the footsteps echoing behind her. The door to the outside was wide open. Lena didn't stop to think. She ran toward it, her breath ragged, and when she reached the door, she slammed it shut behind her, locking it with trembling hands. But even then, she could feel the figure outside, watching her through the glass. She ran to the window, pulling the curtains back, but there was nothing out there, just the dark trees swaying in the wind. Yet she still felt it, the oppressive presence, the watcher. The rest of the night was spent in fear, unable to sleep, staring at the door and windows, waiting for the figure to appear again, but it never did. When the morning came, the house was as silent as ever. Lena knew she had to leave. Something was wrong with the house, something beyond the ordinary. But as she packed her things, she caught sight of something in the mirror, a figure standing behind her. The reflection showed her room, but in the mirror, the figure was standing just behind her, its eyes wide and cold. Lena screamed and turned, but there was nothing there. The watcher had been with her all along, and now it was too late to escape. Story: The Endless Nightmare. Elliot had never been afraid of the dark. As a child, he would spend hours playing in his room, his only companion the shadows that stretched across the walls, bending and flickering with the glow of his bedside lamp. But things had changed. After his parents' sudden passing, the world around him felt different. The weight of the grief, the isolation, seemed to follow him everywhere, even into the night. It started a few weeks ago, the dreams. At first, they were subtle, just flickers of unsettling images. A dark hallway, a door that wouldn't open, whispers in the dark. But soon, they grew more intense, more vivid. The hallway grew longer and darker, the whispers louder and more desperate, and the door that wouldn't open was always just within reach. One night, Elliot woke up to find himself standing in his room, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been dreaming, but it didn't feel like a normal dream. It felt real. He could still hear the whispers in his ears, like they were embedded deep in his skull, and the shadow of something lurking just outside his vision. He tried to shake it off, to tell himself it was just a nightmare, but the feeling lingered. The air in his room felt colder than usual, heavier, as if the shadows were growing longer and closer. He turned on his bedside lamp, the soft glow pushing back the darkness, but something in the back of his mind told him that the light wouldn't be enough. It never was. The following nights were worse. The dreams became nightmares, relentless, consuming. Every time he closed his eyes, he found himself back in that hallway, that long, oppressive stretch of nothingness that led to a door he couldn't open. The whispers became more frantic, louder, as though something was just behind him, always out of reach. And no matter how fast he ran, the hallway stretched endlessly, the door never getting closer. One night, he reached for the door handle in the dream, his hand trembling as he touched it. He had to open it. He had to know what was behind it. But before he could turn the knob, a voice, low, guttural, whispered in his ear, "You're not ready." Elliot woke with a start, his body frozen in terror, the whisper still ringing in his ears. He had to leave. He couldn't stay in this house any longer. Something was wrong with it, wrong with him. But where could he go? His parents were gone, and the house, their house, was all he had left. He tried to talk to friends to get away, but the nightmares always followed him. The dreams were real, he realized, more real than anything he had ever experienced. That night, he tried to sleep again, hoping that maybe the nightmare would end, that maybe it would leave him in peace. But when his eyes closed, the hallway was waiting. The whispers began again, softer this time, like a distant murmur at the edge of his hearing. He couldn't run this time, he couldn't escape, and then it came. A shadow, tall, menacing, moving toward him in the darkness. A figure that wasn't quite human, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The figure reached out for him, its fingers elongated, almost skeletal. The whispers intensified, now a cacophony of voices, each one telling him to go, to open the door. But the door was still locked, and the figure was closing in. Elliot's heart raced as he stumbled backward in his dream, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. Every movement it made was slow, deliberate, as if it was savoring the moment, savoring his terror. The hallway felt endless, the walls pressing in on him, suffocating him. The air was thick with fear. "You're not ready," the figure whispered, its voice impossibly deep, vibrating in the very core of his being. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The figure was so close now, its face just inches from his own, and its breath was cold against his skin. Suddenly, the door behind him creaked. The sound echoed down the hallway, and the figure paused, its glowing eyes flickering as it turned toward the door. Elliot's body moved without thinking, and he reached for the door handle, his hand trembling as it made contact. The moment he touched it, the world around him seemed to freeze. The whispers stopped. The figure stood motionless, its gaze locked on him, waiting. Elliot turned the handle. The door swung open. On the other side was darkness. Complete, suffocating darkness. The kind that felt alive, that reached out with claws to drag you into its depths. But it wasn't just darkness. It was the void, the place between worlds, where nothing could escape and nothing could find peace. And standing there in the midst of it was a figure, his own reflection. Elliot took a step forward, but the figure didn't move. It just stared at him with cold, hollow eyes, its face twisted into a grotesque mockery of his own. "You are me," the reflection said, its voice a distorted echo of his own. "You cannot escape. You never have." Elliot staggered back, the realization hitting him like a wave. This wasn't just a nightmare, this wasn't just a dream, this was his fate. The figure in the mirror raised its hand, and the walls of the hallway began to warp, stretching and twisting, the light flickering as if the dream was collapsing in on itself. The reflection reached out toward him, and Elliot couldn't move. He couldn't scream. The darkness in the doorway beckoned, pulling him closer with every breath. "No!" Elliot shouted, fighting against the pull, but his feet felt rooted to the floor, as though the ground itself was holding him in place. He looked at his reflection one last time, and the figure grinned, its face now completely consumed by darkness. "You are the nightmare, Elliot. You always have been." The world around him began to collapse entirely, the dream fracturing, and just as the darkness closed in, The door slammed shut. Elliot woke up, gasping for air. He was back in his room, in his bed. The room was cold, but he could still feel the weight of the nightmare pressing down on him. The figure in the mirror was still there. Elliot turned toward the mirror on the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected to see, but when he looked into it, there was no one there. But as he stared deeper, something caught his eye. The faintest flicker of movement, a shadow just out of sight. It was him, and this time he couldn't escape. Story. Whispers in the dark. The house had been abandoned for as long as Hannah could remember. It sat at the edge of town, an old Victorian manor with crumbling walls, boarded-up windows, and a rusty iron gate that groaned in the wind. The townspeople always talked about it in hushed tones, calling it the cursed house or the haunted place. But for as long as Hannah had lived in town, no one dared go near it. Yet there was always a pull, a curiosity deep inside her that made her wonder about it. Her parents had warned her not to go anywhere near the old manor, but they never explained why. The house stood there like a dark silhouette against the skyline, its secrets hidden beneath the layers of dust and time. It was only a matter of time before she would find out what lay inside. One autumn afternoon, after finishing her shift at the local diner, Hannah decided it was time. She didn't know why or what drove her to it, but she had to go inside. She told herself it was just for the thrill, just to satisfy her curiosity. The walk to the house felt longer than usual, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves around her feet, and an eerie chill crept up her spine. The house loomed ahead, even more foreboding up close, its broken windows like empty eyes staring out at her. Hannah approached the front gate, which was half open, creaking on its hinges. The rusted metal squealed as she pushed it open further, the sound lingering in the air like a warning. She hesitated, glancing back at the town behind her, then took a deep breath and stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the house. Inside, the air was musty, thick with dust and decay. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, the sounds so loud in the silence that they felt unnatural, almost alive. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, the once elegant patterns now faded and torn in places. Furniture was scattered haphazardly, some pieces toppled, others draped with white sheets that had long since been eaten away by time. As she moved deeper into the house, a soft whisper brushed her ear, so faint that she almost thought it was the wind. She stopped and looked around. The house was dark, save for the faint light streaming in through the broken windows, casting long shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. The whisper came again, this time more distinct, almost like a voice calling her name. Hannah. The sound of her name being whispered in the dark sent a cold shiver down her spine. She froze. The air around her seemed to grow heavier and the temperature dropped, the chill seeping into her skin. There was no one else in the house. She was alone, right? She took a step back, but before she could move further, the whispering came again, louder this time, more urgent. Hannah, come closer. Her heart began to race. The house felt alive, as though it was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. The whisper seemed to be coming from upstairs. The stairs groaned under her weight as she ascended, each step causing the dust to swirl around her feet. When she reached the top, she found herself at a long corridor lined with old doors that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. The whispering was louder now, and the air felt thick with an oppressive energy. A door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, its wooden frame warped and cracked. The whispers seemed to be coming from behind that door. Without thinking, She moved towards it, her breath quickening. Oh. She reached out and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, but there was something familiar about it, something unsettlingly familiar. The walls were covered in faded portraits, and the furniture was draped in thick white sheets, as though the room had been abandoned in a hurry. But what made Hannah stop in her tracks was the large mirror standing against the far wall. The mirror was cracked, but the reflection was still visible. It was her. But something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving. It stood there, staring at her, its face frozen in an expression of fear. The eyes in the mirror seemed to follow her, as if they were alive, watching her every move. "Hannah!" The voice came again, this time from the reflection. "You shouldn't be here." Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, but her reflection didn't. It reached out, pressing its hand against the glass, as though trying to reach her. With a jolt of panic, Hannah turned and ran, but the house seemed to shift around her. The hallway stretched longer, and the rooms twisted, turning into a maze of dark corridors and empty rooms. She couldn't find the way out. Every door she tried led her back to the same place. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent, until it felt like it was surrounding her. The voices of the past, of people long gone, echoed through the house, and the cold, oppressive feeling in the air became too much to bear. She stumbled back into the room with the mirror. But this time the reflection wasn't her. It was something else, a shadowy figure standing in the corner, its face obscured by a hood, its hands twisted and blackened. It whispered again, but this time the words were clear. "You have awakened us." The figure in the mirror reached out toward her, its bony fingers pressing against the glass. The glass rippled like water, and before she could react, the figure lunged at her, pulling her toward the mirror. Hannah screamed, her hands scrambling for purchase, but there was nothing to grab onto. The air around her turned cold, suffocating. The mirror's surface seemed to distort, bending like a liquid, and she felt herself being pulled toward it. The shadows around her grew darker, and the whispering voices surrounded her, now shouting, their voices desperate, angry. "Come back," they begged. "Come back to us." The pull was too strong. She felt her feet leave the ground, her body being dragged into the glass. She tried to scream, but the air was thick, pressing against her lungs, choking her. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Hannah found herself standing in an unfamiliar place. The walls around her were covered in peeling wallpaper, the room dimly lit by a single flickering candle. She could hear the soft sound of footsteps, but when she turned to look, there was no one there. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a shadowy figure stepped into the room. It was the same figure from the mirror, its face still obscured by the hood. Its long, bony fingers reached out toward her, its voice a soft rasp. "You were never meant to leave." Hannah stumbled back, her heart racing, but the figure was already too close. It reached out, grabbing her wrist with an iron grip, and as it did, she saw its face, a grotesque, twisted version of her own. "Welcome home," it whispered, and everything went dark. Story. Haunted by the past. Lena had always thought she was done with her past. After the divorce, the moving around, and the pain of losing herself in the chaos, she believed she was finally ready to start fresh. So when she found an old, run-down cottage on the outskirts of town, far away from the memories of her old life, she knew it was the perfect place for her to heal. The cottage was small, isolated, and charming in a way that made her feel like it was waiting for her. It was just the kind of place she needed, quiet, peaceful, and far from the city that had once consumed her. The first few days went by smoothly. Lena cleaned the house, unpacked her things, and spent long hours walking in the nearby woods. She didn't expect much, just a little solitude and some time to breathe, but something about the cottage felt off. The first night after settling into her new home, Lena went to bed early. The house was still, the air thick with the silence that only a secluded home could offer. But as she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard a soft scratching noise coming from the walls. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the sound of a small animal trying to find its way in. But the sound persisted, and Lena's heart began to race. She convinced herself it was nothing, a product of her imagination. The house was old, after all. Old houses creak and groan, but the sound continued. And every night after that, it grew louder. One evening, after a particularly long day, Lena decided to investigate. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the walls, something that shouldn't be there. The scratching had turned into a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone was trying to get her attention. The attic door was hidden behind a faded tapestry in the hallway. Lena hesitated for a moment before pulling it open, her breath quickening. The stairs creaked under her feet as she ascended, the air growing colder with every step. At the top of the stairs, she opened the door to the attic, the beam of her flashlight flickering slightly as she scanned the room. It was empty, save for a few dusty boxes and old furniture. The walls were lined with cracks, and the floor was covered in layers of dust, untouched for years. But something was wrong. The scratching noise was coming from the far corner of the attic, behind an old wooden chest. Lena's pulse quickened as she moved closer, the noise growing louder with each step. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering above the chest. The tapping stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed felt heavier than ever. She turned the chest's rusted latch, and as she opened it, a cold gust of air rushed out, carrying with it the faintest scent of decay. Inside, there was nothing but dust and old blankets, but at the very bottom of the chest, she saw a small, leather-bound journal. Lena picked it up, brushing the dust off the cover. The journal was old, its pages yellowed and fragile, but what caught her attention was the name etched into the front, M.A. She opened the journal to the first page, her eyes scanning the handwriting that filled the pages. The words were faint, as though written in a hurry. She began reading. "I can hear them again. They're scratching at the walls. I can't escape them. They're here, in the house with me, watching me. I don't know how much longer I can take it. It's been 3 years, and they're still here." A chill ran down Lena's spine as she continued to read. The journal chronicled the disturbing thoughts of someone who had lived in the house long before her. The entries grew more frantic as the person's fear deepened, their obsession with the noises in the walls growing. One entry stood out to her. "They're not real." They can't be, but every time I close my eyes, I see them, their faces twisted and distorted, staring at me from the dark corners of the room. I know I'm not safe here. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She closed the journal, her hands trembling. It was clear that the previous occupant of the house had gone mad. She looked around the attic again, her eyes darting to the corners, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. The house felt different now. The silence was oppressive, and the air seemed thicker, like the weight of the past had settled into the very walls. Suddenly, A loud bang echoed from downstairs, followed by a soft, guttural whisper. "Get out!" Lena froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Get out!" Her legs shook as she turned toward the stairs. Something was wrong. She had to leave. But just as she reached the door, the scratching noise resumed, louder than ever, like fingernails scraping against the walls, echoing throughout the house. She rushed down the stairs, but before she could reach the front door, the house seemed to shift. The walls groaned, the air thickening, and a cold gust of wind blew through the cracks in the windows, extinguishing the candles on the table. The whispers became frantic, almost pleading. "Leave now, before it's too late!" Lena bolted for the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but the door wouldn't budge. She pulled at the handle, panicked, but the door refused to open. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a low, mournful wail. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward her, like dark tendrils, their fingers curling and twitching as they reached for her. She spun around, looking for another way out, but the house seemed to close in on her. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and the temperature had dropped so suddenly that her breath came out in thick clouds. Something was moving in the shadows, something fast and silent. Lena's heartbeat thundered in her chest as she ran to the back of the house, trying the back door. Again, it wouldn't open. The walls creaked, the house groaned, and suddenly the door behind her opened by itself. She turned, gasping, her eyes wide with fear, but the doorway led to nothing but darkness. Something cold and unseen grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her toward the doorway. "Help me," a voice whispered, and though she could see no one, she felt the presence closing in on her, suffocating her. "You're not alone here." Her scream was lost in the shadows. The door slammed shut behind her, and as the whispers grew louder, Lena was pulled into the darkness of the house where the past had never truly left. Story. The Cursed Forest. The forest had always been a place of mystery. To the people of the small village, it was both a sanctuary and a source of fear. Dark and dense, the trees grew so close together that sunlight rarely touched the ground, and the air was always thick with fog. For generations, it had been a place to avoid, a place where children were warned not to wander, and where travelers often disappeared without a trace. But not everyone feared the forest. For Alex, the forest was an escape. He had heard the stories, the whispers of strange occurrences, the tales of people going in and never returning, but he had never believed them. It was just superstition, he thought, just old village lore that didn't hold any real meaning. So when he heard about an old cabin deep within the heart of the forest, a cabin that had been abandoned for decades, he felt a pull. It was a challenge, a dare to prove that the stories were nothing but lies. He packed his backpack with supplies, water, food, a flashlight, and a compass. He didn't expect to be gone for long, a few hours at most. But as he ventured deeper into the forest, the air began to change. The further he walked, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds and insects were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to close in on him. The trees were ancient, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their roots reaching out like fingers in the dark soil. The path beneath his feet was overgrown, barely visible through the thick underbrush. But Alex pressed on, determined to find the cabin. As he walked, he began to feel a strange unease, a sense of being watched. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, following him. The forest was alive with an energy he couldn't explain, and it made his skin crawl. After hours of walking, he finally spotted it. The cabin, half hidden in the trees, its roof caved in and its windows boarded up. It looked like something out of a nightmare, old and decrepit, abandoned by time and nature alike. Alex approached cautiously, his breath quickening. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the wood protesting with a long, drawn-out groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of leaves and debris. The smell of rot and decay filled his nostrils as he stepped inside. The cabin was completely empty, save for old, broken furniture and shattered glass. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved into the wood like some kind of warning. Some of the symbols seemed familiar, but others were twisted, as if they didn't belong in this world. Alex's curiosity got the better of him, and he began to examine the walls more closely. He was about to turn away when something caught his eye, a small, faded piece of paper stuck to the wall. He peeled it off carefully and read the words written in shaky handwriting. The forest takes. It watches. Never stray from the path, for the forest remembers. The words sent a chill down his spine. He turned to leave the cabin, but before he could move, he heard something outside, a soft rustling sound, like footsteps in the leaves. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest was alive with movement, though he saw nothing. The whispers began again, low and unintelligible, carried by the wind. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Alex whirled around, his flashlight flickering in the dim light. A cold gust of wind rushed past him, carrying the scent of something foul, like decay and earth. He tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as he frantically pulled at the handle, but the door remained locked. The whispers grew louder, now clearly voices calling his name. Alex! He spun around, but no one was there. The trees outside the cabin creaked and groaned as though they were moving. The forest seemed to be closing in on him, and the whispers grew louder still, coming from all directions. He turned back to the cabin, his flashlight sweeping the room in desperation. That's when he saw it, a dark figure standing in the corner just outside the beam of light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long for its body, its face hidden beneath a hood. Alex's blood ran cold. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It only moved, its limbs shifting unnaturally as it stepped closer, its feet making no sound against the floor. The whispers were now deafening, echoing in his ears, the voices becoming clearer, more distinct. "Leave this place. Leave before it's too late." The figure raised its hand, pointing toward the door. But the door was still shut tight, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward him, pushing him back. A heavy pressure filled the air, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. Alex stumbled backward, heart pounding in his chest. "I don't belong here," he muttered, desperately trying to get control of his fear. But the figure in the corner didn't move. It just watched him, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. With no other choice, Alex rushed toward the door, trying to break through. But before he could reach it, the figure lunged at him, its hands outstretched. Alex's breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled backward, the figure still closing in on him. He slammed into the cabin's wall, the sound of the wood cracking beneath his weight. His pulse raced as he struggled to move, but the figure was too fast. It reached out with its long, twisted fingers, grabbing him by the shoulders and lifting him off the ground. The room spun around him, the whispers now filling his mind, drowning out everything else. They were all around him, in his ears, in his head. The voices spoke in a language he couldn't understand, each word more desperate than the last. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said in a low, rasping voice. "The forest takes, it watches." Alex fought against its grip, but the figure's strength was overwhelming. His mind raced. The words from the journal flashed in his mind. "Never stray from the path, for the forest remembers." The ground beneath him shifted, and he felt himself being pulled into the earth, as if the cabin and the forest itself were swallowing him whole. The walls seemed to distort, warping around him, and the shadows grew darker still. "No!" Alex screamed, struggling to break free. But the figure's grip tightened, and as it did, he felt something cold, ancient, and powerful sink deep into his bones. It wasn't just a figure. It was part of the forest, part of the curse that had trapped him here. The whispers grew louder, now almost deafening. "You cannot escape. The forest never forgets." With a final desperate push, Alex twisted free from the figure's grasp, falling to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, his vision blurry, but he could still hear the whispers in his head, the cold grip of fear tightening around him. Without thinking, he bolted for the door again. The figure was close behind, but this time Alex didn't stop. He smashed into the door, the wood splintering beneath his weight. The whispers followed him, but he didn't look back. He ran through the trees, the path now clearer than ever before, though the forest felt alive, as though the trees were moving to trap him. He stumbled and fell, but he kept running, driven by fear, driven by the knowledge that if he stopped, he would be lost forever. When he finally broke through the trees and saw the edge of the forest, he dared not look back. The whispers had stopped, but he could feel the weight of the forest, its eyes, its presence, watching him. He never returned to the cottage, and he never spoke of what happened in the forest. But sometimes, when the wind was just right, he would hear the whispers again, faint and distant, and he would remember. The forest never forgets. Story: Restless Souls. The old mansion on the hill had always intrigued Clara. It sat alone at the edge of town, its stone walls covered in ivy, windows shattered, and the roof caving in at certain points. For as long as she could remember, the mansion had been the subject of whispered stories, the kind of tales that children told each other to spook one another, yet the adults seemed to take them with an unsettling seriousness. They said the mansion was haunted. They said it was cursed. They said the souls of those who had died there never left. Clara had heard the stories for years, but she'd never given them much thought. To her, the mansion was just an abandoned house, a place that had fallen into ruin with no one to care for it. It was part of the landscape of her life, something to glance at on the way to work, but never something to think about. That is, until she found herself standing at its iron gate one cold autumn evening. It was after an exhausting week of work, and Clara felt like she needed a change of scenery. She had always been drawn to the mansion, despite the rumors, and that evening, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she felt a pull toward it. The wind howled through the trees as she approached the gate, her breath rising in foggy clouds in the crisp air. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the rusty gate, pushing it open. The metal groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the empty landscape. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark silhouette against the grey sky like an imposing figure waiting to judge her. As Clara walked toward the house, the feeling of being watched crept over her, but she shrugged it off. After all, it was just an old, abandoned house. Still, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach, the tension that was growing with every step. She reached the front door and found it ajar, as though someone had been expecting her. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew. A gust of wind blew through the broken windows, sending a shiver down her spine, but she pressed on. The floor creaked under her weight, and the walls seemed to whisper, faint sounds like distant voices muffled by the silence. Clara paused, listening. Was that just the wind, or something else? She shook her head, trying to brush off the anxiety creeping up her spine. It's just an old house, she muttered to herself. But even as she said the words, she couldn't deny the feeling that something was very wrong. As she ventured deeper into the mansion, she felt the temperature drop. The air grew colder and heavier, the darkness pressing in on her like a tangible force. She reached for the flashlight in her bag, flicking it on. The beam illuminated the hallway, revealing old portraits hanging crookedly on the walls, their eyes seemingly following her every move. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow. A figure standing motionless in the doorway of a room just beyond the light's reach. Clara froze, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She turned quickly, but the shadow was gone, as though it had never been there. Her breath quickened, and she took a step back. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, and the temperature dropped as if the walls were closing in. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping her inside. The house seemed to sigh around her, the walls groaning as though they were alive, suffocating her. The whispers returned, this time louder, more insistent. Clara. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but the chill it sent down her spine was unmistakable. She spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the shadows dancing in the corners. Clara. The voice came again, closer now. She turned to find herself face to face with a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her hair disheveled and hanging around her face. Her eyes were wide, hollow, as though she had seen too much, as though she had lived through horrors Clara couldn't even begin to comprehend. I'm sorry, the woman whispered. I didn't mean to scare you. But you need to leave. We can't leave. We're trapped here. Clara's throat went dry. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman's face contorted in pain, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something more, but couldn't. Leave, the woman whispered again, her voice growing fainter. The figure began to fade, but not before her eyes locked onto Clara's, filled with desperate sorrow. And then, just like that, she was gone. Clara stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Her heart was racing, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison. Leave, leave, leave. The voices echoed around her, bouncing off the walls, filling her mind. She clutched her head, trying to block out the noise, but it was impossible. The house was alive with the voices of the restless souls that still lingered within its walls. She ran. The doors and windows seemed to shift, closing in on her, the path to the outside growing farther away. The house was trapping her, its walls pushing her toward the heart of its darkness. She could hear footsteps behind her now, heavy and deliberate, like someone, or something, was chasing her. She ran faster, her legs growing tired, but she didn't dare stop. The mansion was a maze, its rooms twisting and shifting, trapping her at every turn. The whispers became deafening, the voices urging her forward, urging her to find the exit. But the house wouldn't let her go. It was feeding on her fear, on her panic. Finally, after what felt like hours, Clara stumbled through the front door. The cool night air hit her like a wave, and she gasped, her body trembling. She turned to look back, but the house was silent now. The whispers had stopped. The door hung open, but there was no sign of the woman, no sign of the restless souls. The mansion stood there, still and lifeless. But Clara knew better than to think it was over. She knew it would never let her go. The house had already taken something from her, something she couldn't explain. It was haunted by the past, by the souls that had once lived there, and they were not done with her yet. As she turned and walked away, the whispers followed her, lingering in the back of her mind. And she knew she would never be free. A week later, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching her. The whispers followed her, faint echoes carried on the wind, trailing her as she walked away from the mansion. Each step she took away from the house seemed to pull her further into a cold, shadowy abyss, her mind swimming with uncertainty. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But as she reached the edge of the forest that surrounded the mansion, the whispers faded, leaving only silence in their wake. It was a silence that was thick, suffocating, as if the very air around her was pressing down. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a secluded place. It was the silence of something ancient, something waiting. Clara forced herself to keep moving, her feet stumbling over uneven ground as the darkness seemed to swallow the path ahead. It was a long walk back to town, but as she walked, she kept hearing those words in her mind. Leave. We're trapped here. That night, she stayed in a nearby inn, unable to sleep, her mind racing. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the windows made her heart jump. Every shadow in the room seemed to shift, as though it was reaching for her, pulling her back into the mansion, back into the darkness. The feeling of being watched never left her. The next morning, when Clara tried to tell herself that it had all been a nightmare, the unease still gnawed at her. She couldn't forget the woman's hollow eyes, the pain and sorrow etched into her face. Clara had experienced fear before, true fear, the kind that paralyzes you. But this was different. It wasn't just fear. It was an oppressive weight, something beyond the living, something old, angry, and desperate. She tried to leave the town, tried to ignore the house that still loomed in her mind, but the pull of the mansion was stronger than ever. It was as if something was drawing her back, something she couldn't escape. A week later, Clara returned. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the guilt that gnawed at her, the feeling that she hadn't helped the woman in the mansion, the souls trapped within its walls. Or maybe it was the nagging thought that something was unfinished, something left undone. She walked back to the mansion with trepidation, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of 1,000 eyes that seemed to be watching her every move. She reached the gate, and it creaked open with the same eerie sound it had made before. The house stood silent, like a sleeping beast waiting for her to approach. With each step she took, the whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder as she neared the front door. She could hear them now, in her ears, in her mind, the voices of the souls trapped inside the mansion, each one pleading for release. As she stepped inside, the house greeted her like an old friend, the cold air surrounding her, wrapping her in its embrace. The shadows seemed to come alive, shifting and changing as if they were no longer static, no longer just part of the building. She moved through the darkened halls, her flashlight flickering in her trembling hands. The house felt alive. The walls whispered as though they were breathing, The floor creaked under her weight, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The room she had been in last was unchanged, but something was different now. The mirror was gone. In its place was a dark figure standing just behind where the mirror had been. It was the woman. Her face was still twisted with sorrow, but now there was something new in her eyes, a flicker of recognition.
"You've returned,"
the woman whispered, her voice trembling with a strange mixture of relief and despair.
"Why? Why have you come back?"
Clara took a step back, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape, but she couldn't. Something in the woman's eyes, something deep, something ancient, held her in place.
I don't know why I'm here,"
Clara whispered, her voice barely audible.
"I thought I could forget. I thought I could leave."
The woman stepped forward, her form shifting, as if she were both part of the room and not. Her body seemed to flicker, the edges blurring and distorting, like a reflection in a broken mirror. The air around Clara grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply. "You cannot leave." "Not until it is done," the woman said, her voice trembling. Her form seemed to grow more solid, but her face remained a twisted mask of agony. "I was one of them." "One of the souls who was trapped here. And now, you are too." Clara's heart raced. The walls around her began to close in, the shadows growing thicker, and the whispers grew louder. They were no longer just words, they were screams, desperate, mournful. She could hear them now, in her very bones. "We are all trapped here." She turned, trying to escape, but the walls shifted, blocking her way. A heavy pressure filled the air, as if the house itself was pushing her toward the heart of its darkness. The figure in the corner was closing in on her again, its shadow stretching across the floor, consuming everything in its path. Clara turned, running toward the door that wasn't there, the whispers and shadows chasing her, pulling her back into the heart of the mansion, into the void. And then there was nothing,